August 12, 1944. Midday sun scorched the Arizona desert at the U.S. Army's POW facility near Fort McClellan. The barbed wire fences reflected the light like silver teeth, and the rows of wooden barracks trembled under the heat. 1,200 Japanese prisoners, haggard, gaunt, and wary, moved in formation for roll call, their hands bound by the invisible chains of fear, shame, and hunger. Private Kenji Matsumoto thought he had endured everything war could throw at him. Ambushes in New Guinea, frostbite in the mountains of Bougainville, the deafening roar of American artillery in Leyte. But nothing had prepared him for the silence that greeted him here. Not the silence of the desert, but the quiet that hovered in the infirmary, where something entirely unexpected awaited. At first, Matsumoto mistook it for a trick of the sun, a mirage shimmering over the linoleum floors and the smell of antiseptic. But it wasn't heat, it was a presence. A nurse, her uniform crisp and unassuming, moved among the cots. She touched each patient with a lightness that seemed unnatural, smoothing bandages, adjusting blankets, whispering words in a voice that had no bite, no judgment. Her hands were gentle, almost impossibly gentle, as if she were handling fragile glass. Matsumoto's first reaction was disbelief. Japanese training had taught him to expect brutality. The world of prisoners of war was cold, calculating, relentless. A wound might fester for lack of care. A fever could become fatal if ignored. But here, the hands that cleansed pus from festering sores, the voice that soothed the panicked and delirious, were a force as alien as it was potent. He watched as she moved to Corporal Hiroshi Nakajima, a young man with a shrapnel wound still raw from weeks earlier. The nurse bent over him, murmuring softly, and Matsumoto noticed how Nakajima's muscles slackened for the first time in days. The tension rolled out of him like water from a cracked jug. Across the room, another prisoner, Sergeant Taro Yamamoto, twisted his face in disbelief. He muttered something under his breath, a curse, a question, a prayer, he couldn't tell which. For years, their captors in the field had been ruthless, and the soldiers had grown numb to fear. Starvation, exhaustion, wounds, disease, all had left marks that would never heal fully. But a simple act of care, the touch of hands that didn't scold or demand, cut deeper into their hearts than any bullet or bayonet ever had. The infirmary's scale of care was precise. 500 cots arranged in meticulous rows, 12 nurses rotating shifts, 200 patients receiving treatment at any given hour. It was efficiency, but efficiency colored with something foreign, compassion measured not in orders or inspections, but in human decency. Matsumoto began to notice the patterns. The nurse would spend a full 5 minutes with each patient, listening as they murmured in broken English or Japanese, sometimes answering back in a way that made them laugh or cry without knowing why. She was methodical but never rushed. Even the uniforms carried a subtle reassurance. White fabric folded precisely, but not sterile in the harsh sense of discipline, sterile in a way that promised safety, attention, life. The prisoners who had expected nothing but punishment and neglect found themselves staring at a reality they hadn't trained to imagine. The first test came when Matsumoto himself was summoned to the infirmary. Fever had twisted him into a fragile shadow of his former self. He shuffled forward, ashamed, trying to make himself invisible. The nurse took his pulse, lifted his eyelids, inspected the rash spreading across his chest. She did not flinch. She did not recoil. She simply treated him, and in that moment Matsumoto felt something he hadn't since leaving Japan, a quiet sense that his body, his existence, mattered. He thought of home, of the streets of Osaka and the smell of rice cooking in his mother's kitchen, of the soft hands that had bandaged his small cuts as a child. And he realized, with an odd twist of fear and relief, that the war had never prepared him for tenderness. It had only prepared him to die. He flinched when her hands touched the bandage on his wrist, expecting some cruel jest or reprimand. But she simply adjusted it, murmuring a phrase in English he didn't understand, and moved on. Every prisoner she touched emerged slightly more human than they had entered. The nurse's presence became a quiet axis around which the camp spun. She was invisible to the guards in their dark green uniforms, focused on routines and inspections, but to the prisoners, she was impossible to ignore. She redefined the mathematics of captivity. For every week spent in the camp, her hands repaired what bullets and neglect had destroyed, and every patient began to carry a fraction of that care back into the barracks. Even the strongest men, the ones who had laughed at death and spat on orders, now hesitated when she entered a cot row. Matsumoto watched Corporal Nakajima sit up straighter, eyes wider, hands trembling. Every movement of hers seemed to balance fragility with authority. The prisoners whispered among themselves, words carried in broken accents, stories passed at night beneath the thin blankets. The nurse, she saved my life. She doesn't yell, doesn't punish. Her hands are light like water. It was not magic. It was discipline married to empathy. In a world built on the rigid hierarchy of war, the nurse had built something almost unimaginable: trust. For Matsumoto, that day marked a subtle transformation. Where he had expected only suffering, he found a possibility. That survival might not be measured in cunning or endurance alone. That human kindness could exist even in a prison camp, could be precise, professional, and yet still shock a hardened soldier's soul. By nightfall, the infirmary hummed quietly. Matsumoto lay on his cot, fever still clawing at him, but he felt a strange warmth not just in his body but in his mind. Somewhere between pain and relief, between fear and disbelief, he realized that the nurse's hands had done more than heal flesh. They had begun to repair something deeper, a fractured sense of self. The camp outside remained a cage, the fences as unyielding as ever, the guards patrolling with rifles and stern faces. But inside, a fragile sanctuary had emerged, defined by nothing more than careful touch, whispered words, and relentless grace. Matsumoto closed his eyes and thought, almost in a whisper to himself. Perhaps this was the hardest kind of battle to win, not over enemies, not over nature, not over death itself, but over despair. And in that realization, the first thread of hope in years began to form. The following morning, the desert sun struck the barracks with a ruthless brilliance. Matsumoto moved slowly along the gravel path, each step an effort, his muscles stiff from fever and the restless nights spent on the thin cot. Around him, the camp stirred like a great, uneasy hive. Prisoners carried water buckets, cleaned the rows of barracks, or lined up for breakfast rations, eyes downcast, shadows of men who had walked the edge of life for months on end. Even as they moved mechanically through the routines imposed by guards, whispers traveled like secret currents. "Did you see her yesterday? She saved Nakajima from infection. Her hands, they don't burn like fire, they heal." Matsumoto paused at the infirmary door. He could hear it again, the quiet shuffle of feet, the soft murmur of voice, the faint hiss of antiseptic being poured into a basin. Inside, the nurse moved among the cots, her presence a stark contrast to the harsh geometries of the camp. Here, time seemed to bend. Moments expanded, illness and injury became manageable, and fear felt almost negotiable. Corporal Nakajima lay on his cot, eyes closed, but Matsumoto could see the tension release in his jaw as the nurse attended to the wound on his shoulder. With delicate precision, she cleaned the bandage, replaced it, and spoke words in soft English, words that somehow carried meaning even to those who could not translate. Nakajima's hand, which had twitched involuntarily at the pain of previous treatments, remained still. It was not merely physical care. It was a rehearsal of patience, empathy, and trust, conducted with exacting discipline. Matsumoto felt a strange tug in his chest. He had been trained for war, conditioned to accept suffering, to endure hunger, fever, bullets. But no training had prepared him for the quiet authority in those hands, for the ability to command care without a raised voice, to restore dignity in the midst of captivity. Outside the infirmary, the camp continued its rigid cadence. Guards moved along the fences with rifles slung, eyes scanning for any misstep, any sign of defiance. Prisoners worked in muted clusters, shoveling sand, stacking firewood, or repairing broken fences. Orders barked, flags raised, whistles blown, the usual machinery of discipline. But within the infirmary walls another order reigned, one that carried no threats, only the promise that life could be preserved, if not fully reclaimed. Days passed, each indistinguishable from the last in the eyes of those who had grown used to the monotony of captivity. Yet subtle changes unfolded, almost imperceptible among the prisoners. Matsumoto noticed how men moved with slightly more confidence toward the infirmary, how conversations began to carry small injections of hope. Sergeant Yamamoto, who had spent nights trembling with fever and despair, now walked with a hint of uprightness. Even the youngest, Private Ito, began to ask questions in his halting English, curiosity softening the edges of fear. Meals, meager as they were, became moments of shared relief rather than mere survival. Prisoners exchanged small gestures of camaraderie, a rationed piece of bread, a wink, a nod, and each act felt heavier with significance against the backdrop of deprivation. The nurse's influence extended beyond the infirmary. It had begun to permeate the rhythm of daily life. One afternoon, a sudden wave of dysentery swept through the camp. The infirmary filled quickly, with men collapsing into cots, their bodies racked by fever and pain. Panic rippled briefly, only to be quelled by the nurse's calm, methodical presence. She moved from cot to cot, assessing, treating, and soothing. Matsumoto watched her lift a trembling prisoner's arm, apply an antiseptic, replace the bedding, and murmur a gentle reassurance. For a moment the patient's eyes softened, relief spreading across the pallid face. The prisoners began to whisper again, this time with something bordering on awe. She touches without hurting. Even the fever seems afraid of her hands. We are alive because of her. Even the guards, stern and impassive, took note. Lieutenant Reynolds, overseeing the camp's medical operations, remarked quietly to his subordinate, "She has a way with them. They respond faster, recover sooner. It's remarkable." It was remarkable indeed. Within weeks, the mortality rate in the infirmary dropped significantly, a numerical testament to the power of careful, precise care. But the impact went beyond numbers. Something fragile, almost imperceptible, had begun to mend in the prisoners themselves. Trust, long eroded by years of combat, humiliation, and deprivation, began to creep back. A man could dare to speak. He could dare to ask for help. He could dare to believe that pain might be alleviated, not mocked. Matsumoto found himself reflecting on his preconceptions. He had believed that war stripped humanity away, leaving only survival instincts, fear, and rage. Yet here, within the rigid lines of a POW camp, he saw proof that compassion could exist even in extremity, that gentle hands could command more allegiance than rifles, more loyalty than threats. One evening, the nurse paused by his cot. She adjusted his blanket, brushed a lock of hair from his forehead, and offered a faint smile. Words were sparse. The gesture spoke volumes. Matsumoto felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the desert chill. For the first time in months, he felt something approximating hope. The transformation unfolded quietly. Men who had once moved like shadows now carried themselves with a tentative confidence. Conversations in broken English and Japanese became more frequent. A sense of routine began to stabilize the camp, not through fear or coercion, but through the rhythm established by care. The nurse's presence was both anchor and compass, guiding the prisoners through the tumult of captivity. It was not a fantasy. It was disciplined, measured, and profoundly human. Night descended on the desert, washing the barracks in muted silver light. Matsumoto lay awake, listening to the distant hum of the desert and the quiet shuffle of nurses moving between cots. He realized that the camp had shifted subtly, irreversibly. Survival no longer depended solely on endurance or cunning. It depended also on the fragile, astonishing possibility of trust. He closed his eyes and let the realization sink in. In a place designed to break men, to reduce them to nothing, the nurse's hands had begun to weave a different story. One of life, dignity, and unexpected grace. It would not erase the scars of war. It would not undo the suffering, but it offered something else, a fragile proof that humanity could persist, even in the heart of captivity. Weeks passed, and the desert sun grew merciless. The heat cracked the wooden barracks and scorched the gravel paths, but inside the infirmary, life quietly persisted. Matsumoto noticed the subtle changes around him each day. Men who had once shuffled silently now lingered in the infirmary, waiting their turn for treatment, their eyes tracking the nurse with a mixture of hope and disbelief. She moved among the cots with precision, yet each motion carried a softness that contradicted the harshness of the world outside. She applied salves to infected wounds, cleaned bandages, adjusted bedding, and spoke in hushed tones that seemed to erase fear. For men who had been reduced to shadows of themselves, her hands were a strange salvation, a presence that reminded them of a world beyond suffering. Nakajima, who had once flinched at every touch, now looked up at her with something approaching trust. Matsumoto watched as the nurse lifted Nakajima's arm, examined the bruising along his forearm, and murmured a word in English he didn't fully understand. Nakajima's hand, trembling at first, relaxed, and for the first time in weeks, he exhaled without pain. Outside, the camp carried on its rigid routine. Guards patrolled, men toiled in the sun, and the fences remained as unyielding as ever. Yet the rhythm inside the infirmary was different. Each patient who survived treatment carried a fraction of that care back into the barracks, spreading small currents of hope and subtle discipline. Conversations, once limited to whispers of fear or resignation, began to include laughter, brief smiles, and tentative stories of home. Even the youngest prisoners began to observe her methods, learning from the consistency in her care. They saw how she cleaned without judgment, how she measured her touch carefully, how she moved with the calm authority of someone who knew the exact balance between efficiency and compassion. These lessons, absorbed in silence, slowly altered the way men interacted with one another. The camp, though still a cage, began to exhibit a fragile sense of order that was no longer enforced by fear alone. One afternoon, a violent dust storm swept across the camp. Sand whipped against faces, stung open sores, and turned the world into a chaotic blur. Many prisoners stumbled blindly, their footsteps uncertain, their hearts racing. Yet in the infirmary the nurse continued her work. She moved from cot to cot, adjusting blankets, ensuring wounds were protected from the grit, speaking softly as the storm raged outside. Matsumoto witnessed Nakajima reach out instinctively, trying to steady a fellow prisoner who had fallen. He realized that the care they had received was already influencing their behavior. Small acts of grace were spreading through the barracks, teaching even men trained for war and survival to respond with patience and caution rather than panic. At night, when the camp fell silent and the wind moaned across the desert, Matsumoto found himself reflecting on the transformation. For months, he had believed that survival depended solely on endurance, cunning, or brute force. Yet here was proof that another power existed, subtle, quiet, and persistent. Compassion, carefully applied, could shape behavior, restore dignity, and even change the dynamics of captivity. A sudden fever struck one of the younger prisoners, Private Ito, in the middle of the night. He convulsed violently, and his cries echoed through the barracks. Guards barked instructions, but they could do little beyond ensuring he remained confined to his cot. It was the nurse who arrived, moving swiftly yet calmly. She examined Ito, measured his temperature, administered fluids, and whispered words that seemed to anchor his panicked mind. Within hours, Ito's convulsions subsided, and by dawn, he rested quietly. The prisoners all grew. They began to refer to her presence not as a nurse but as a force, one that existed outside the usual rules of the camp, outside the rigid hierarchy of captors and captives. They whispered among themselves, stories of her kindness becoming almost mythical. She does not just heal, she restores us. Her hands know the body and the soul. Matsumoto began to document the small changes. Men who had been sullen and withdrawn now helped each other carry buckets, shared meager rations, and spoke in quiet tones of encouragement. The infirmary's influence rippled outward. By treating the sick with patience and precision, the nurse had created an environment where survival was more than a matter of physical endurance. It was a matter of collective resilience. The guards noticed the difference, too. Lieutenant Reynolds, a stern officer, remarked one afternoon, "I've never seen prisoners respond this way. They respect her, and through that they respect the rules." The observation was unintended but accurate. Through her care, the nurse had instilled a form of discipline that was neither imposed by threat nor enforced by punishment. It emerged naturally, rooted in trust and the recognition of human decency. As the weeks continued, Matsumoto watched a quiet camaraderie develop among the prisoners. Nakajima taught Ito how to dress minor wounds. Yamamoto shared small portions of food with those weaker than himself. They were learning, almost unconsciously, that survival was no longer a solitary endeavor. It was interconnected. And at the center of that transformation was the nurse, moving among them like a fulcrum, her hands balancing pain and relief with a skill that seemed to defy exhaustion. One day, a prisoner collapsed from dehydration. The nurse arrived before anyone else, kneeling beside him, lifting his head gently, and adjusting the water supply to his lips. Matsumoto noted the shift in the man's gaze. Fear replaced by trust, panic replaced by tentative confidence. For the first time, he saw the full magnitude of what she had achieved. Each life she touched carried a fragment of hope into the wider camp. Each recovery reinforced the fragile thread connecting men to each other, and to the possibility of survival. Even in the sweltering heat, even under the watchful eyes of guards, the infirmary had become a sanctuary. The prisoners began to organize themselves subtly, lining up for treatment, helping those less mobile, anticipating needs before being asked. Matsumoto recognized it as a silent form of resistance, the cultivation of humanity in a place designed to strip it away. And through it all, the nurse's hands never faltered. They were precise, patient, and unwavering. No injury was too severe, no fever too high, no despair too deep. She moved among them with the consistency of ritual, yet her presence felt personal, intimate, as though each patient mattered in a way that transcended duty. At night, Matsumoto would lie on his cot, listening to the low hum of conversation in the barracks, the soft footsteps in the infirmary, and he realized that something profound had shifted. The camp had not changed in structure, the fences, the guards. The rules remained as unyielding as ever, but the prisoners themselves had changed. Fear no longer dictated every action. Despair no longer dominated every thought. They had learned that survival could coexist with dignity, that pain could be eased, and that life could be preserved even within captivity. It was not fantasy. It was quiet, deliberate, and entirely human. By the end of the third week, Matsumoto could see the cumulative effect. Men walked taller, spoke with more confidence, and carried a subtle spark of hope in their eyes. Even the most hardened, those who had once scoffed at the idea of kindness, had begun to anticipate the nurse's presence. Her influence radiated outward, changing not only their physical condition but the very fabric of their interactions. And Matsumoto understood, finally, that her work was more than medical. It was moral. It was the restoration of something that war had almost erased, the belief that they could matter, that they could be seen, that they could survive and retain a sense of self. The morning sun broke over the desert horizon, casting a harsh, golden light across the gravel paths and wooden barracks. But inside the infirmary, time seemed to stretch and soften, carrying the familiar rhythm that had come to define life in the camp. Matsumoto rose slowly from his cot, feeling the lingering warmth of health and vitality, a sensation that had once been foreign to him. The infirmary was alive with activity. Men moved purposefully, helping one another dress wounds, adjust bedding, or carry supplies. The young prisoners who had arrived terrified and trembling weeks before now walked with tentative confidence, guided by the example of those who had learned the patterns of care. Every touch, every gesture, reflected lessons absorbed from the nurse's hands. Nakajima moved beside Matsumoto, adjusting a bandage for a younger soldier with the same meticulous care he had once only observed. Yamamoto distributed water and whispered reassurances, and even Ito, once paralyzed by fear, assisted with cleaning and organizing. The barracks had become a web of cooperation, a fragile but resilient ecosystem sustained by trust and careful attention. The nurse moved through the cots with quiet authority. Her hands adjusted, healed, and soothed, but her presence extended beyond mere physical care. Each patient who experienced her touch carried a piece of that calm into the wider camp, influencing behavior, fostering cooperation, and reinforcing hope. It was a subtle, invisible transformation, yet its effects were undeniable. Matsumoto observed her bend over a prisoner recovering from a fever, her movements deliberate yet gentle. The man's eyes, once filled with panic, now reflected a cautious optimism, a fragile belief that life could persist even in confinement. He had learned to trust, to rely on care without suspicion, to accept kindness without fear. It was a quiet revolution, one measured not in artillery fire or strategic maneuvers, but in the soft, steady pulse of restored humanity. Outside, the camp remained unchanged in structure. Fences still enclosed the prisoners, guards still patrolled, and the desert sun still scorched the earth. Yet the prisoners themselves had shifted. Fear and desperation had been mitigated by trust. Despair had been tempered by the consistent application of care. Men who had once moved as shadows now carried themselves with a dignity that had been nearly erased by war. Even the guards took notice. Lieutenant Reynolds remarked privately, "I've never seen anything like it. They respond faster, they recover better, and they treat one another with respect. It's entirely because of her." Captain Harlan nodded silently. Her influence was undeniable. It was neither authority enforced by weapons nor coercion imposed by rules. It was a moral force, manifest in the simple act of treating each person as though they mattered. Matsumoto felt a profound gratitude that transcended words. The nurse's care had restored his body, yes, but it had also restored something deeper, the capacity to feel, to trust, and to hope. He realized that the war had tested more than his endurance. It had tested his ability to believe in the persistence of human decency. And in that infirmary, in the precision and grace of her hands, he had witnessed a quiet victory over despair. He moved through the infirmary, assisting Nakajima with a minor task, and felt the rhythm of cooperation that had become second nature. Men spoke softly, laughed briefly, and offered small gestures of aid. Even the youngest prisoners had learned to anticipate needs, to care for one another in ways that had once seemed impossible. The nurse's presence had created a ripple effect, and the current now flowed through the entire camp. Matsumoto paused to watch her adjust a bandage on Ito's arm. She did so with the same precision, gentleness, and patience that had defined every interaction. And as he watched, he understood the full magnitude of her work. She had not simply healed wounds or treated fevers. She had restored agency, dignity, and a sense of shared humanity in a place designed to strip it away. The prisoners began to whisper among themselves, no longer in fear but in awe and gratitude. "She saved my life. She sees us as people, not enemies. Her hands, they carry hope." These words circulated quietly, embedding themselves in the psyche of men who had long been conditioned to expect only suffering. By the 5th week, the camp had been irreversibly transformed. Daily life now carried a rhythm rooted in trust, cooperation, and care. The infirmary, once merely a place to endure illness, had become the moral center of the camp. The prisoners had learned that survival was not measured solely by endurance or cunning, but by the recognition of humanity in others. Matsumoto, standing beside Nakajima and Yamamoto, reflected on the journey. They had arrived as broken men, stripped of hope, trust, and dignity. Yet here, under the consistent, deliberate, and gentle care of a single nurse, They had learned to survive not only physically but morally. They had regained the capacity to help, to trust, and to believe in human decency, even in captivity. Night fell over the desert, washing the camp in muted silver light. Matsumoto lay on his cot, listening to the low hum of conversation, the soft shuffle of feet in the infirmary, and the quiet murmur of the nurse tending the last of the cots. The fences and guards remained, unyielding and unmoved, yet the prisoners themselves had shifted irreversibly. The war outside the camp might continue, with all its violence and destruction, but within these walls, a subtle, enduring triumph of humanity had emerged. In that moment, Matsumoto understood that victory could take many forms. It was not always measured by weapons, strategies, or territory. Sometimes it manifested quietly in the restoration of dignity, the healing of bodies and souls, and the rekindling of trust and hope where none seemed possible. The nurse moved among the cots one last time before night fully claimed the camp, adjusting blankets, checking pulses, and whispering words that carried reassurance. Her hands, precise and gentle, had done more than heal wounds. They had rewritten the possibilities of captivity itself. Matsumoto closed his eyes and felt, for the first time in months, a sense of peace. The prisoners' bodies had been sustained, their minds stabilized, and their spirits subtly restored. In a camp designed to break men, the nurse had preserved their humanity, and that, Matsumoto realized, was the most extraordinary victory of all.